The limits of modern warfare. Why you can't escalate on borrowed money. Section 1. Modern warfare is no longer defined solely by military strength or political resolve. It is defined by financial capacity. As conflicts intensify, the decisive constraint shifts from the battlefield to the balance sheet. Governments can mobilize troops and deploy weapons, but sustaining escalation requires continuous access to affordable capital, stable currency conditions, and functioning debt markets. When war pressures the yield curve, the nature of the conflict changes. The question is no longer who can escalate further, but who can absorb the rising cost of doing so without destabilizing their own financial system. Borrowing costs rise, currencies come under pressure, and investor confidence becomes as critical as military positioning. In this environment, the bond market does not merely reflect war, it constrains it. Nations that rely on external financing or fragile domestic absorption face hard limits on how far they can go. Even those with monetary sovereignty must contend with inflation, currency credibility, and the long-term consequences of sustained fiscal expansion. The modern reality is clear. No matter how strong a nation's military may be, it cannot escalate indefinitely on borrowed money. The ultimate boundary of war is not set by weapons, but by the cost of capital required to sustain them. Section 2. The 1956 Suez Crisis, Britain's humiliating financial reckoning. The classic illustration remains the Suez Crisis. Britain and France, with Israel, invaded Egypt after Nasser nationalized the canal. Militarily, the operation succeeded rapidly. Politically and financially, it collapsed. The invasion triggered a speculative run on sterling. Britain's dollar reserves hemorrhaged, losing roughly $280 million in 1 week alone. The pound, fixed at $2.80 under Bretton Woods, faced collapse. The United States refused IMF support and signaled it could dump holdings of British government bonds, gilts, or block access to dollar liquidity. Chancellor Harold Macmillan warned the cabinet the exchange rate could not be held without American help. Britain accepted a ceasefire on November 7, 1956, and withdrew. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned soon after. Suez did not merely end a colonial adventure. It publicly demonstrated that Britain could no longer project power independently when its currency and debt markets were vulnerable to external pressure. The bond market, amplified by U.S. leverage, proved the final arbiter. Historians mark 1956 as the decisive moment Britain lost global hegemony. Section 3. Vietnam, America's inflationary overstretch. 2 decades later, the United States confronted similar limits in Vietnam. Direct military costs reached approximately $111 billion, over $1 trillion in today's dollars, from 1965 onward. Financed largely through deficits rather than immediate tax hikes, the spending hit an already near full employment economy. Inflation accelerated sharply, from under 2% in the early 1960s to over 6% by 1969. Demand pull pressures from war contracts combined with Great Society programs overheated the system. The Federal Reserve accommodated much of the borrowing, expanding the money supply. By the late 1960s, the U.S. faced rising deficits, a weakening dollar, and the eventual breakdown of Bretton Woods convertibility in 1971. Vietnam showed that even the world's reserve currency issuer cannot escalate indefinitely without domestic financial consequences. Guns and butter policies strained the yield curve and eroded confidence, contributing to the stagflation of the 1970s. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 4. Soviet-Afghan War, the hidden economic drain. The Soviet Union's 1979 to 1989 intervention in Afghanistan offered a parallel from the other superpower. While direct costs were estimated at roughly 2 to 3% of annual military spending, not bankrupting on their own, they compounded deeper structural weaknesses: chronic inefficiencies, falling oil revenues, and an inflexible command economy. The war drained resources, diverted skilled manpower, and fueled domestic disillusionment. Combined with the broader arms race and falling commodity prices, it accelerated the fiscal pressures that contributed to Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika reforms and ultimately the USSR's dissolution in 1991. Even a closed system with full domestic debt absorption faced limits when war drained productive capacity without generating returns. Section 5. Russia and Ukraine, Sanctions and Domestic Bond Dependence. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 provides a contemporary case. Sanctions cut Russia off from much of the international debt market and froze reserves. Moscow responded by shifting to domestic financing, heavy borrowing through ruble-denominated bonds, tax hikes, and directing state banks and the central bank to absorb debt. War spending now consumes roughly half the federal budget. Inflation has spiked, central bank rates reached 21% at points, and energy export revenues have declined under tightened sanctions. While Russia has adapted through parallel trade and higher domestic production, the economy shows signs of overheating, labor shortages, and stagnation risks by 2026. The conflict demonstrates that even nations with low initial public debt face hard choices when external markets close and domestic absorption distorts credit allocation. Section 6. Japan, the model of domestic absorption. Japan stands as the counterexample of deliberate insulation. With public debt exceeding 250% of GDP, Japan maintains stability because the Bank of Japan and domestic institutions, banks, insurers, pensions, hold the vast majority of Japanese government bonds, JGBs. Foreign ownership remains low, around 6 to 12% in recent years. Even as the BOJ's share dipped toward 49 to 50% by early 2026 amid gradual normalization, the system avoids heavy reliance on foreign bond vigilantes. This domestic heavy structure gives Tokyo more policy freedom, though it is not costless. It ties monetary policy tightly to fiscal needs and suppresses yields artificially for decades. Japan shows the upper bound of stuffing debt down domestic throats, possible with monetary sovereignty and cultural savings habits, but still not infinite. Section 7. The United States today, debt yields, and the Iran conflict. The U.S. now tests these dynamics amid its own elevated debt load, national debt surpassing $38 to $39 trillion by early 2026, and involvement in the 2026 Israel-Iran conflict. Additional defense spending pressures, potentially hundreds of billions for munitions, replenishment, operations, and regional commitments, arrive while the U.S. must refinance roughly $10 trillion in maturing debt annually. Treasury auctions have shown softer demand at times, with 10-year yields spiking above 4% during escalation phases before easing on ceasefire news. Concerns about oil shocks from Hormuz disruptions, higher inflation expectations, and sustained deficits have pushed term premiums higher. Foreign holders, including Europe, which holds trillions in U.S. assets, retain latent leverage, as seen in earlier threats tied to Greenland-related tensions. Even with the dollar's exorbitant privilege, the bond market signals limits. Weaker auction demand raises borrowing costs, which compound interest payments already exceeding $1 trillion yearly. Prolonged escalation risks crowding out higher yields or forced monetization with inflationary consequences. Section 8. The enduring lesson. Across these cases, Suez exposing Britain's sterling vulnerability, Vietnam fueling American inflation, the Soviet quagmire hastening decline, Russia's sanctioned domestic pivot, Japan's insular model, and America's current debt yield tensions, the pattern holds. Military power can initiate conflict, but financial capacity determines duration and intensity. Nations ignoring the bond market's verdict do so at their peril. Domestic absorption has ceilings. Foreign holdings create hostage risks. Monetary sovereignty buys time but not immunity from inflation or credibility loss. In the end, the yield curve and capital access impose the ultimate boundary on escalation. No modern power can wage indefinite war on borrowed money without confronting the hard arithmetic of its own balance sheet. The bond market remains undefeated.